So great to have everybody joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you're joining today, we hit our limit on our Zoom, so you made it in. And if you're watching this on the recording, thanks for your patience and apologies if you were trying to get in. I'm Ben Cornell, and I'm co-founder of Edtech Insiders alongside Alex Sarlin. And today's topic is the future of AI tutoring, building what actually works. When we were talking about AI and its potential 2, 3 years ago, we all imagined tutoring as a potential application. And now we're bringing speakers who are really making it work in real time, in real use cases, and real scenarios. So how do you go from the abstract potential to reality? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Before we go too much further, I want to thank our sponsors, Starbridge, Cooley, Higher Education, and Tuck Advisors for supporting these webinars and supporting us across our podcast and our newsletter. At the end of this slide presentation, you'll also see ways that you can join the EdTech Insiders community. Next slide. So a little bit about us and our hosts. There's a whole team behind Alex and I. Sarah, Sharon, and Jen are huge parts of our work here at EdTech Insiders. So thank you so much for the three of you. If you want to be in our newsletter or have newsworthy events, please reach out to Sarah. If you want to sponsor, please reach out to Sharon and podcast Jen. So thanks so much for all of our teammates. And now I'll quickly introduce our panelists before we dive in. So today we have an incredible panel. We could have 3 or 4 hours. We could have a whole week of time with this incredible group. We've got James Donovan, Head of Learning and Cognitive Outcomes Research at OpenAI, Irina Jarenka, Research Director of Learning at Google DeepMind, Kristen DeSherbo, Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy, Andrea Passanetti, Co-founder and CEO of Kira, and Maharishi RB, Founder and CEO of Supernova. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining. All right. And so my team would kill me if I didn't front load. If you want to learn more about EdTech Insiders, check out our Substack, our LinkedIn, our podcast, and our YouTube. And part of how we pay for all of this is if you become a subscriber, this is through Substack. If you become one of our monthly paid subscribers, it's like $15 a month. That helps pay for all of this stuff. So please check us out. Sharon, you can go ahead and take the screen down, and we're going to jump in with our questions. So panelists, we're going to start with just the current landscape of AI tutoring. And I'm curious, like, what inspired you? So maybe tell us a little bit about what you do, and then also, what was the moment that convinced you AI tutoring could meaningfully improve learning outcomes, not just engagement? What did you see that made you think, oh man, this could actually work? Let's start with you, James.
Thanks, Ben. Great question. Before we get going, just to say a massive thank you to you and team for organizing this awesome event. Amazing to be on a panel with some familiar faces, and very excited to hear what everyone else has to say. Thank you also for the introduction. Just as a recap, James Donovan, I look after our learning and cognitive outcomes research. Bit of a mouthful of the title. Really, it just means that we are very interested in the underlying cognition that enables learning. And so we also do research into more foundational things like memory, creativity, critical thinking, alongside obviously more traditional learning outcome style work. I guess the scientist in me, to answer your question, Ben, got hooked when I started seeing data coming in from such a broad range of deployments. So in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Mongolia, as well as in higher ed across the US and the whole world, and seeing this constant uptick for pedagogically aligned model use, which could sometimes be somewhere between 0.5 to 1 standard deviation gains across so many different contexts and subjects, which made me think this could be quite transformational. But on a personal level, probably my excitement came from seeing more of the anecdotal data about special needs and additional needs education use cases. My mom's a special needs teacher. I am myself dyslexic. And that really felt like it could be a space where there would be big leverage. So that's what got me hooked.
Awesome. Thanks so much, James. Kristen.
Hello, and thanks for having me. Thanks to all of you who are spending some time today to listen to us. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy. What does a Chief Learning Officer do? I in a lot of organizations might be called the chief product officer, but I come from an ed psych background and lead through thinking about learning. So I'm the chief learning officer. I lead our product management, design, content, community support, and assessment teams at Khan Academy. I don't want to assume everyone knows Khan Academy.
Mhm.
Online learning and instruction platform. In March of 2023, we launched Conmigo, who is our AI-powered tutor for students and assistant for teachers. And the piece where I thought that generative AI might be
Mm.
useful in helping solving some of our education problems came in early September of 2022. Totally going to flex and name drop here. When Sam Altman and Greg Brockman came to Sal and I and said, let's look at this latest model we're developing. And they were showing it answering all of these biology questions. And we said, like, well, this is great, but we don't want it to answer all the questions. And they said, oh, if you say you are a Socratic tutor and I am a student, don't tell me the answers, it'll act differently. And we tried it and it did. And we were like, what is this? Now, it turns out it's a little bit harder to get it to act like a tutor than those three sentences. But that was kind of the initial, like, oh my gosh, there could be something here.
Yeah, I think we had you on the podcast right after that. And
You did, yes.
also, thank you so much for clarifying generative AI. Lots and lots of forms of, or several forms of AI, and some of them have been around for a long, long time. Andrea, you come from a technical, deep background as well as education. When did it first dawn on you that this was a game changer?
Yeah. So first of all, my name's Andrea. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I co-founded a company called Kira. I'll get into more detail on Kira further up the chain in this conversation. But the way to understand Kira is really an end-to-end operating system for education. So we cover everything from being an AI native LMS, covering MTSS, curriculum generation, as well as assessment. Um, my perspective on tutoring started in a very different place in terms of how AI can be an enabler for tutoring, or how we could wrap AI in the semblance of a tutor. In fact, I was fairly skeptical to start, and I had the opportunity to watch Khan Academy and Conmigo take root and grow and experiment even with Conmigo. Um, I was always a little skeptical about a tutor that didn't have full context on a student, which is really why we tackled this from the perspective of MTSS and curriculum development first. I think an excellent tutor in real life should be the paradigm. It should be the example that an AI tutor follows, and to the extent that we can develop something that hews asymptotically closer to how a human tutor would work, we know that we're on the right track. And I think early AI tutors struggled with that context. I think they had strong understanding of concepts, and it was possible to get them to operate Socratically in the way that Christine was describing, but they could operate Socratically in a somewhat naive way without understanding of what students needed Socratic guidance on, or where there might be conceptual understanding gaps that needed scaffolding and rescaffolding so that a student could get to a point of mastery in their learning. So my confidence in AI tutoring really sort of escalated, I would say, over the past year as LLMs have gotten better, or as LLM adjacent systems have gotten better at managing context. As LLMs develop memory, or as we're able to replicate elements or the semblance of memory in an LLM, I think we're better able to hew more closely to what an excellent AI tutor could do. And I think that frontier has evolved dramatically, and we're pretty close to it now. So I would say my confidence in AI tutoring is more recent, and for those reasons.
Mm. Yeah, really interesting how that influenced how you developed your product, even those first impressions. Maharishi, when did it dawn on you that AI was a game changer?
Hi everyone, I'm Maharishi. I'm from India. I'm the founder of Supernova. Supernova is an Indian AI tutor startup, and our mission is an AI tutor for every learner. And we're starting that with an AI spoken English tutor for India. Now, coming to your question, I think when we looked at this technology, I agree with Andrea, which is I don't think it was suitable for teaching everything. Even today, I don't think that's the case. It really depends what you're trying to teach. In our case, we're trying to teach people how to speak English. And that is very important because India is a country where English really matters. Any white collar job, 90% of them demand that you speak English. But there are very few opportunities for people to speak and learn, right? Because it's a very low per capita income country. So the kind of options that were available where you could watch YouTube videos of someone teaching you how to speak, that's not going to work because you can't just watch a video and suddenly end up speaking. And or you could go to a class with 40 other people, but that's not going to work again because you don't get that one-to-one speaking practice. So in our case, it's fundamentally and nothing beats a tutor if you could afford one, but most people can't afford a one-to-one personal tutor, which is very important if you want to speak and learn. So we saw a massive gap over there. In fact, my own parents had joined a WhatsApp-based spoken English course. And the way it used to work is every day you're allowed to speak once, and they'll give you a lesson, which will be a video on your WhatsApp, and you would record a voice note, right? It's a monologue. That's you speaking. You wait for a few hours, and a tutor on the other end would give you feedback, which is another voice note. When we looked at that and the kind of solutions that were available, it was very obvious to us that even at that point, the very early LLMs could give you that one-to-one speaking practice, give you that feedback, and it was still going to be way better. And today, obviously, it's gotten significantly better than at that point. So that's how we got started. That's where our conviction comes from.
That's awesome. And when you see these old school ways, I mean, WhatsApp's still a little new school, but then the ability for AI and step in and meet those like urgent needs and actually fulfill a gap in supply and meet the demand, it's pretty profound. Arena, what was your aha moment?
Thanks, Ben, for inviting me at the last moment. I'm really happy to be among this great group and good to see again Kristen and James. So I am a research director at Google DeepMind. And if you're not familiar, DeepMind is essentially an AI research lab within Google. So the way we work is we really look for very hard scientific problems and we try to solve them with the hope of kind of unlocking benefit to the world. So tutoring is a great example of that, kind of very hard problem to solve, and it's foundational. So it kind of unlocks a lot of kind of downstream benefits. So I actually have background in neuroscience, and I did a lot of kind of theoretical research before going into language model research. And for us, the moment where we realized the potential of AI in education was like really early. I think maybe around the same time as kind of Kristen mentioned. So it was before kind of AI became a conversation at the parties. So I was working on improving reasoning in language models at the time. And so I was really kind of concentrating on how can you make language models essentially do better at the exams, academic exams. And we made some progress. So I was kind of looking, how do you turn that into a grand challenge, kind of to make it really DeepMind scale problem. And as a neuroscientist, I started looking into how do humans use reasoning, develop reasoning, and it became pretty clear that we actually really kind of develop and finesse our reasoning through formal education. So as I kind of like dug deeper into that line of inquiry, I actually realized that there was a problem that was like much bigger than what I was thinking about, and that I should definitely look into, and that's kind of how to make AI actually be better at teaching humans rather than doing kind of the work for humans. We looked into it. We looked at the kind of potential promise there. I think our leadership really got bought in with it. So around 3.5 years ago, we put a project around this. So my work really is about how do we bring learning science and kind of pedagogy into Google's AI, so Gemini models. Then how do we really evaluate that we're doing the right thing? So I think a lot of the benchmarks really look at what models can do, and we realize we need to look at what effect do models have on humans, like slightly turning things around. So we developed a way to measure the pedagogical alignment of models. And another thing is kind of working closely with Google's products to actually build the learning features, like the guided learning experience in the Gemini app.
Thanks, Arena. That's also a great transition to our next topic, which really is around evidence, design, and learning science. So you'll note that our panelists here are not tech evangelists where it's technology solves all. There's really deep thinking about how do we implement, what's the use cases, and so on. And when we say AI tutoring works, or when you're looking for evidence that it works, what matters most? Is it engagement? Is it learning gains? Is it retention, transfer, learner confidence, something else? So maybe you can speak for your organization. How do you define success? And also, where do you find current tools still fall short, whether that's a generalized LLM or some of the tools that you see out in the market? Where as a space do we need to figure things out more? I'll just open this up broadly to the group, so anyone feel free to jump in.
We're going
Go
to
for it, Kristen.
go in terms of where we are. So we started out with a theory of action, as good evaluation folks do, where we said, if you have access to a tutor, that will result in good tutoring interactions, which will result in increased cognitive engagement among students, which will result on our platform, we call it more skills to proficient. As you work on skills on Khan Academy, you go from attempted to familiar to proficient to mastered, which we know that then is an indicator that you're going to be more successful in things like standardized tests that are external to our platform. So when you have a theory of action, you can test each of those things along the way. Does this lead to good tutoring interactions? Okay, let's look at the human tutoring literature, identify what good tutoring interactions are, and see if the tutor does those. Great. Actually, that's actually not the hard part. Next, does that lead to greater student cognitive engagement? And here we used a framework that Mickey Chi, who's a professor at Arizona State University, my alma mater, but and her colleague Ruth Wiley. It's called the ICAP framework, and basically it states that as students go from passive to active to constructive to interactive kinds of interactions, they learn more. And so we actually have created a way, an LLM as judge, to judge the transcripts of students as passive, active, constructive, et cetera. And then can look at, are students actually having the kind of engagement we know is necessary for learning to occur? And this gets to the ideas of, are we looking at cognitive offloading, or are we looking at giving support to students and what that looks like? So that's been a good tool for us as we think about it. And I will tell you, we see more IDK, more, passive kinds of interaction than we would like, then is certainly ideal for where students are going. And so one of our big, as we're
IDK, for
thinking
those
about,
of you following along, means I don't know.
I don't know. That's what tech speak from kids. And so then one of our challenges, how do we think about the interactions that Conmigo is having, using that measure as a dependent variable to try to then increase the amount of cognitive engagement and thinking that students are engaged in when they work on the tutor.
Just a quick follow-up there, Kristen. Did you have that framework before you were using AI, or what did you have to implement once AI came along? Or was this whole thing actually de novo when you started launching Conmigo?
So I was aware of the framework, and when we started building Conmigo, I talked to our designers and product managers and engineers about this was what we were going to try to do with Conmigo, but we didn't really have a sense of how we would use it in an evaluation sense. I was actually using it as a framework we were trying to create more kinds of constructive interactions, and that was a potential that AI brought us that we didn't already have in the system. And so then one of our folks on our efficacy team we have these hackathons where it's not just engineers hacking, but like the whole organization works on projects. And two of our efficacy folks used a hackathon week to figure out how to label conversations with these and got to so that they could get into agreement with each other and built the LLM judge. And here we are.
Yeah. Andrea, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. You have a unique challenge in that it's not only the tutoring, but you're trying to bring in strands from basically across the entire learning journey to bear in the tutoring cycle. How do you think about efficacy, design, and engagement?
Yeah, I think I view it a lot through the lens of product and what a tutor is doing in different contexts. I think tutoring as a concept, it spans a lot of different use cases. You can have a tutor who is actually providing something sort of proximal to one-on-one tier one type instruction. You can have tutoring that's intended as scaffolding to support a student with sort of bridging misconceptions or filling gaps in knowledge. Or you could have tutoring that is simultaneous to an instructional process. So if a student is, learning a concept on video, for instance, as might be the case for Khan Academy, or in a more traditional kind of textbook type setting or environment. The tutor can be providing sort of parallel guidance so that the student can address misconceptions or areas of misunderstanding as they come up in real time. And I think each of those settings requires something very different from a tutor. In terms of efficacy and engagement, there are a lot of micro interactions that happen between students and tutors that can pull a student out of the illusion of tutoring, which I think also impacts the pedagogical efficacy of the tutoring experience. So if the tutor is providing one-on-one instruction, or it's providing assistance to the student as the student is working through curricular content, any latency, a question of 2 to 3 seconds delay between when a student asks a question and when a student gets a high quality answer can cause distraction. It can cause a student to move on. It can cause a student to lose their own context in terms of what they're learning and why they're asking a particular question. An incorrect answer, a duplicative answer, an answer that maybe is not leveled properly in terms of reading level or concept difficulty, or an answer that presumes knowledge that the student doesn't have, can all have a very negative impact on engagement and ultimately learning outcomes. So thinking through the granularity of those experiences and thinking through the perspective of a student as they're engaging with the tutor is where I view this from at this stage. The reality is we're in very early innings of AI tutoring. And there's a lot of data that suggests it works very well. And there's a whole world of counter arguments that suggest it doesn't. Fundamentally, a lot of it comes down to what you're observing and perspective and opinion. And I think the reality is we'll know with a lot more certainty over the next few years what is effective and what isn't. And I think the more positive outcomes will be driven by solutions and interventions that are designed and constructed in a way that really puts the student experience front and center. I do think for AI, we talk a lot about who it's being built for. And I think for tutoring in particular, starting with the student experience, really putting the student in the most sort of primary position in terms of design and implementation is very key. So I view it through that lens, and at this point index less on what longitudinal studies are telling us, because a lot of those longitudinal studies that are a year old are based on technology that's maybe 2 years old, and so don't necessarily have the directional value or the fundamental value that one might want from a study of that sort.
Yeah, one thing I'm taking away from your comment is the complexity of this challenge, depending on the learning contexts. There's a wide difference between skills practice and introducing new concepts, a wide difference between embedded tutoring, like I'm stuck, help me get unstuck, versus, discrete tutoring where I'm setting up a session. And in certain contexts, like continuing the engagement might be the higher priority, whereas in others, it might be academic mastery. Which, by the way, goes to show, I think, a bigger point I hope folks take away is that throwing kids on ChatGPT or on Gemini or on Claude and saying learn by itself is probably not the sole mode that we want to lean in on AI and education. Maharishi, I'm really curious to hear, from your standpoint, and then Irina and James, just as learning scientists, like how you wrap that together. So Maharishi, how do you think about impact and efficacy in learning science?
So a few things. So the first thing that we did is we deal with adults, right? So I guess it's a little more easier than dealing with kids because their motivation is clear. If they're paying for a course, at least they know what they want. So that probably removes one level of uncertainty for us. But the second thing that we did is very early on, we decided if you're going to teach other people to master a language, then we've got to put ourselves through that journey because then the feedback loop is a lot faster. So what we started doing within the organization is all of us started picking a third language. Typically in India, you know your mother tongue and then you know English. And then so I started learning Hindi. And then we would test a bunch of things on ourselves, where then you start understanding as a learner, does this pedagogy work for me? And you could literally do that with someone who knows Hindi, who will act as your tutor, a human tutor actually, and then you'll try to see what worked in a particular interaction and try to replicate it to the AI tutor and put someone else through the pure AI tutor experience and keep fine-tuning it that way. So that is about just feedback loops. One of the hacks that we found is anything that you're trying to teach anyone, you've got to do that face to face with a few people at your office. That's how you design the experience, because otherwise it becomes very hard. You build something digitally, you roll it out, and then you're staring at dashboards all day long. It's just too slow, right? So that's the other thing that we did. And one more thing that we did very early on is we figured out the rubrics early on. As in, although we didn't figure out the pedagogy, we figured out how to measure things. That we broke down English into a bunch of skills. So we could ask, and AI is pretty good at measuring if something is going on. Let's say you design a very nice test and you were to automate your measurements with AI. That is something that is very good at today, right? So we could at least say whether someone was mastering a particular skill or not. And the last surprising thing that we found out is it's a very complex problem, right? So we were constantly optimizing for engagement and retention, and then learning outcomes won't come. So we kept going through a bunch of rabbit holes. But at some point, we put our foot down and said, let's just build learning outcomes first and let it be hard. Let it be sometimes cognitively heavy. Maybe users will drop off. That's all right. We'll separate those two problems. We'll do learning outcomes first, and we'll compromise a little bit on the fun side if need be. And then we'll push people through this journey. And then whoever goes through it will obviously become better. And we are getting better at making more people go through that journey. So that's how we've tackled this problem.
Fascinating. James and Irina, as you hear this and you think about not only the space, but also in many cases, your models are underlying technology for what we've been hearing about. How do you think about learning science, design, and efficacy?
Shall I jump in first? I feel like we're all too polite here. We're just letting each other go. So for us, we really think about an evidence-based kind of approach to everything. And we break down the evaluations into kind of model, product, and then actual implementation, because I think these are three potentially fundamental blocks to what the kind of final result on the students' learning will be. So just to take guided learning as an example, we started similar to Kristen with kind of this hypothesis that pedagogically aligned model, kind of pedagogically aligned conversation should lead to better learning in students. So we first started by looking like, is Gemini actually pedagogically aligned? And what is good pedagogy? I think that actually ended up being a much harder question than we originally anticipated. So we spent a lot of time, maybe the first year of the project, talking to teachers, students, learning scientists. We reached out to Khan Academy very early on just to kind of learn from all of you as well, because if you have so much experience in this space, like what are we actually trying to build here? And kind of mirroring Maharaj's point, the very first thing I personally did was this Wizards of Oz experiment, where I asked a few friends who were actually learning something to pretend I was an AI tutor, and I was essentially joining the chat with them as they were learning, and I asked them to kind of just ask the questions they would ask an AI tutor, and I tried to experience what an AI tutor perspective would be like, because communicating through chat and turn-based is very different than the kind of human-to-human real-life interaction that human tutors tend to have. And I think I may have seen one of my participants in the chat joining below. So hi, Miji, if you're there. So kind of started there. We came up with 5 learning science principles. So we think AI should inspire active learning, manage cognitive load, adapt to learners, stimulate curiosity, and deepen metacognition. And then we kind of designed this approach of how to evaluate models against these principles. We have kind of a whole set of evaluations, from auto-evaluations where models kind of judge themselves, but we find that they are great for fast iteration, but they're kind of little spotlights, so they can't be comprehensive just because of how AI critics tend to work. So we did need some human evaluators, and we designed this whole scenario-based arena pipeline that we published in one of our tech reports, where expert educators judge how 2 different models perform in the same learning scenario across many different scenarios sourced across different educational needs, kind of head-to-head under different pedagogical conditions. And we basically iterated on the model. We realized that Gemini and basically no model could do this well through just prompting. So we needed to do technical work to actually make sure Gemini understands these pedagogical instructions better. So we kind of iterated until the point where last year we saw that Gemini was actually the best model at following pedagogical instructions. And that gave us confidence to go to kind of build the guided learning and also go to the kind of ultimate level of testing, which is randomized control trials. So that's kind of the model side. On the product side, there's kind of another layer of complexity. So here we have control of what pedagogy we think guided learning should have. So we actually have a teacher on the team who wrote that prompt. But here it's kind of a delicate balance where you need to keep it pedagogical, but also make sure the users engage with it and enjoy the experience, and that don't lose motivation. And I think it's a very tricky balance to find. So we, again, had evaluations both with students and teachers to kind of try and find that balance. And once we kind of have that, we are now running randomized control trials in schools to test the kind of the third implementation layer. As Ben, you said, you can't just throw AI out into the world and hope that it will kind of be adopted in the way that you hope. So we work very closely with teachers to try to understand how does it fit in their classroom, how does it work alongside them to really enhance the human connections between the students, the teachers, and kind of the whole ecosystem, and to be this additive thing that brings something extra and kind of force multiplies all the good stuff that's happening in the classrooms. And we basically partner with multiple organizations to try and understand what works. So we had an RCT with ED, which is a UK startup. We published that in November. And there we integrated Gemini, the model, into their platform and showed that the interactions actually improved students' learning outcomes above interacting with human tutors, which we were very surprised about. It was a small effect, but it was unexpected.
But there was still human in the loop involvement in that one, right? It's
Exactly. So
I think one thing that we also maybe lose nuance in is, and I've just heard in your comment a lot of talking about teachers and educators and integrating. It's not a binary all AI tutor or all human tutor. That one was like a blend. Can you just explain a little bit?
Yeah, so in that particular situation, so ED is somewhat similar to Khan Academia, I think. So it's math based. You work through problems, and if you get the problem wrong, the default is you get kind of a static hint or explanation, kind of mini lesson. For some students, they get connected to a human tutor for a text-based one-on-one interaction. And then in this study, we added a third arm where sometimes when a student got connected to a human tutor, there was AI in the loop. So essentially, LearnLM, so our Gemini models would provide a draft response, but the human tutor was ultimately in control. So they would review the message and decide how much they want to edit it, if at all, and would send the message. And so we found that actually the majority of the lessons, I think over 80%, the edits were minimal, just 1 or 2 characters, kind of like removing emojis. And when the larger edits happens, that tends to be at the end of the chat, where the AI just wanted to continue the conversation, and the human tutor said, like, yeah, it's enough, let's stop here. So that was, I guess that's one interesting way where AI, so the tutors reported that the AI sometimes taught them interesting new pedagogical techniques. They felt that they could be more productive with AI. So normally they would have like 1 or 2 chats going in parallel, but with AI they could go up to 6. And essentially AI brings this extra element that maybe human tutors struggle with, which is kind of always on, always patient, like really knowing all the details that are provided to the AI in the context, whereas the teacher would have to actually spend the time reading, what happened with the student, what do they know, what do they not know.
Yeah, so fascinating. Almost a different angle of like human tutor efficiency and efficacy on that. James, just to round us out on how you think about learning design, learning science, and efficacy. ChatGPT, at one of OpenAI's most popular products, is adopted by so many kids around the world and schools around the world, but you're also underlying AI for many, many apps. How do you think about this? And how do you guide people who are using your product in so many different ways and contexts?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And a lot of super interesting conversation already. I'm just going to put as a sort of sticky note to return to. I think it can be tempting to assume that what you want is AI behavior that very closely mimics what a human tutor would do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not obvious to me, given how social human cognition is, that in fact that will lead to the same outcomes, as people don't behave towards AI in ways that actually mimic how they do towards other humans. And it can actually be a little risky because it leads you slightly down an anthropomorphization pathway where you're trying to act ever more like a human, which has its own risks and challenges. Not that I think that's what Andrea was suggesting, just that is a risk inherent in that approach. Maybe unsurprisingly, given that my life before OpenAI was mostly cognitive neuroscience, and I was doing a lot of work in brain-computer interfaces and Alzheimer's therapeutics and stuff like that, we did start primarily from a cognitive science perspective, and that was research we were doing with Stanford. And I can see some of the collaborators from Stanford on this call today. So love to see you all. Plus, I've worked with Oxford, MIT, IIT Madras, all over the world, really to try and understand what are the cognitive capabilities that we most care about, and how do we build a taxonomy around those. Some of them are similar to what everyone else has mentioned. So metacognition, task persistence, creativity, memory, emotional regulation, things like that. And then figure out how to build a library of interaction patterns that we thought would influence or reinforce those cognitive capabilities. And that's what went into the post-training of the models. And fundamentally, I'd probably argue that context is critical, tooling is critical, but it's the behavior of the model that often sets the platform for all these other potential gains. And so that was why we were so interested in trying to understand how to shift model behavior to reflect some of these pedagogical best practices and lift up the frequency and quality of those interaction patterns that we felt matched the underlying cognitive capabilities we cared about. But of course, that's all relatively theoretical, science informed, but it doesn't really make sense in the real world. So then what we've ended up doing is very large scale B2B deployments with universities or with entire countries. You may have seen our EDU for Countries announcement 2 weeks ago, where we run massive randomized control trials. So for example, in Estonia, it's a 20,000 person, 12-month randomized control trial, where we enable the ministries, teachers, schools in those countries to further modify their behaviors based on what they're seeing in context, and effectively live track the impact that we think that's having on learning outcomes. And we measure those learning outcomes through a combination of analyzing the interactions between the model and the learner, sometimes with human in the loop, sometimes it might be homework prep, so human adjacent, but then also pushing cognitive tests and standardized testing through the ChatGPT interface, which means you get a rolling baseline score about what's happening either for skill-specific things or subject-specific things, but also for higher order metacognitive or cognitive scores. And that creates a feedback loop that you can then say, okay, when the model behaves like this, people tend to behave like this. This is what it does to the scores, and try and refine on that basis. The reason we do that with countries versus sort of ChatGPT trying to do it directly ourselves or OpenAI, which would be viable given that we probably have the biggest user base of anyone learning on the platform in the world, is simply because AI want it to be fully genericized. We don't want any PII data coming to OpenAI. But B, you really need to understand the context of learning. You only see so much when you look at sort of AI human interactions, and what you really want to understand is why are they doing it, the world they're doing it in, the other factors that affect that. And that really needs to be led by teachers and educators. So the aim is to empower them to make the changes that drive that forward. Some of that was also technical work, as you can imagine. So things like memory and personalization, including needing to do a lot of work on getting the models to be good at following system instructions. Yeah. And we have now invested a lot in that. And I think, though, every day there's a new benchmark. The most recent crop, so 5.2 to 5.3, are best generally at following instructions, though I'm sure that will change and evolve as we go. So that was the science part of it. There is a corresponding product experience there. So we have our own study mode and things like that. I do consider that to be very lightweight study mode. So most of the work is in these kind of B2B deployments where we know the context of use and we can be a little bit more tailored. But the benefit of study mode was that we could experiment with, in more naturalistic settings, how do you pivot up the kind of friction and the amount of engagement required for someone to actually learn something compared to the more assistant style vanilla behaviors you get when you just open ChatGPT out of the box, to try and strike that balance that Maharishi was speaking to, where it's high friction enough that learning is actually happening, but still engaging, exciting to use. And we really are able to do that at massive scale, hundreds of millions of people, which gives you a good sense of exactly where to put that as we drive it forward.
Can I ask a question?
We're in we're in a conversation about AI and the technical innovation, but we're actually talking about deep pedagogical elements, which are really about how learning happens, assessment, feedback loops, and also the roles of people and relationships, which I think raises questions about how do we implement. And James, I appreciate the provocation. Are we looking to mimic or parallelize human tutoring? And with AI, are we able to think about new constructs and new interactions? Because we want to go from the theoretical to the practical, I'm actually curious to hear from our team who've implemented. Andrea, maybe you could talk a little bit about your work in El Salvador. Kristen, you have a fascinating research about India, and you basically had one go at implementing and a second go, and the before and after is incredible. And then Maharishi, I'm sitting with a question too: is it different for younger learners and adult learners in terms of how we implement, and what does that look like? So maybe Andrea, you get us started on that. What does real implementation look like?
Sure. I had a question for James as well, and I'll couch it within the context of kind of the work we've been doing. I don't really think about AI tutoring mimicking human tutoring. I think more about what makes tutoring effective in absolute terms, and what are human tutors, which we have a large sample to look at, doing in the way of effective tutoring. I actually think if we look back 20 years, even 30 years, at initial studies and designs around how AI could achieve good outcomes on the tutoring front, and we look at intelligent tutoring systems, kind of the precursor to LLM powered tutors. The concept of outer loops and inner loops, so kind of the more student facing instructional elements, the inner loop being kind of at the level of individual problems, hints, and feedback, the outer loop being more the scaffolded curriculum that was the foundation for the inner loop interactions. There's a lot that was deconstructed from effective human tutoring, and I think what we often focus on in these conversations is the inner loop tutor. So if we present a student with an LLM interface like a ChatGPT or whatever generic or slightly modified version of an LLM interface, what will they do with it? How will they learn? What questions will they ask? How will they prompt? It's very inner loop focused. And I think we can sometimes lose sight of the outer loop, the canonical foundation for that interaction, which is scaffolded, high quality instructional material in the lowercase sense of that term. And that's where we've really been focused. In El Salvador, we have a large implementation that's supported at the country level, as well as a number of others. We start with the scaffolded instructional material, scaffolded courses that are built by curriculum developers with a view towards making sure that things are properly scoped and sequenced, their standards aligned, et cetera. I think for instructional purposes, starting with that foundation and then allowing a tutor to be a coordination layer on top of it, personalizing, rescaffolding, rescoping instruction in a way that meets students at their specific levels, or helps students deconstruct the precursor knowledge that is causing them to get stuck in their learning journey. We find that's a very effective approach. Interestingly, when we were first working on Kira, and it was more of a research project than an actual implementation, we thought a lot about graphs, so knowledge graphs with nodes and edges, and being able to run machine learning on those graphs, both to really understand what the relationship between concepts is, and then being able to project student knowledge graphs on top of the foundational knowledge graph to understand where there might be gaps in understanding that a tutor or some AI intervention could help bridge. And what we have found is that approach is actually a lot less effective than allowing LLM reasoning to deduce from student interactions what that upstream misunderstanding or misconception might be. And so when you're able to do that, and then you're able to relate that misconception or misunderstanding to the full course of study that student is on. So what is the grade level material that student is being exposed to and expected to master, and you start rescaffolding those foundational materials, those outer loop materials, I think that's where you see real effectiveness in terms of how inner loop tutor type interventions can drive change. But I think it requires some foundational high quality human vetted material to be the foundation for those interventions, rather than something that is purely driven by the student or the learner. So that would be
framework of the inner and outer. And there's a way in which your approach, kind of building full stack, you are building the full context, whereas other folks have an approach of being a piece of that and connecting high quality instructional materials and assessment loops and so on. So from another conversation, we can talk about the business strategies that people are employing to try to infuse AI into those inner and outer circles. Kristen, can we hear a little bit about the things you've learned about implementing in real world? Not necessarily full stack, but you've been around for a long time as an organization, and some of your research in India was just really eye-opening. So please share.
Yeah, so lots of folks know Khan Academy started as a videos from Sal's closet that individual users found on their own. In 2018 and 2019, the organization shifted to having a purposeful classroom strategy in order to reach not just the students who are out there motivated to do their own thing, but to get to the students who really need the help, but maybe aren't looking for it. Then the challenge becomes, how do you get students overall to use the product? We can create the best interactions, the most thing. And if students don't use it, they're not going to get there. Lawrence Holt wrote a blog post about the 5% problem, which is essentially saying that about 5% of learners get to the levels of usage, which can be very low, like 30 minutes a week, but only about 5% of students get to those levels of usage that are going to result in learning gains. So the question becomes, how do you get that? And what we saw is the biggest driver of that is not gamification, it's not bonuses and rewards, it's the teacher. It's what does the teacher tell them to do and ask them to do and assign them and hold them accountable for and motivate them to do. But we recently ran a study with Khan Academy India in schools, in social welfare schools, where we had two groups, a group of 28 schools, that's a treatment group, a group of 55 schools is the control group. In the treatment group, that everyone had access to Khan Academy. So this is not a study of whether Khan Academy works. It's a study of implementation. The treatment group hired a paraprofessional. So basically put an ad in the newspaper and hired someone without any education background really, but whose job was make sure the students can log on, make sure they're being accountable for the lessons that they're supposed to be doing, give them the motivation, give them the high fives, the pat on the back, like doing that kind of work. That was their job. So compare these two over 7 months. The treatment group, the group that had the person who was there like doing the implementation work, effects has a 0.44. So pretty significant for that effect of having a person, not even a trained teacher, who's helping to guide that implementation. And so I think we can't just be focused on what is the technology and is it doing the right tutor move right now, but how are we making sure that students are engaging with the product overall?
We could go on and on. Thank you so much, Kristen, for that example. We're going to go to quickfire questions now. So we've got last 5 minutes, and I'll go ahead and direct them. So Maharishi, question is adult learning harder or easier, and why for AI tutoring?
I think it's easier, is what I think. And before that, actually, very surprising. I agree with Kristen completely, because one of the things that we found out is just having a person who will call you and hold you accountable. That's all they do. They don't teach. Their job is to say, why do you start? And have weekly check-ins with you and say, you're making this kind of progress, so keep at it. Just doing that for us boosts our retention by 3x, right? So if it's, say, month 6, we're finding 70% of the people are still continuing with the program if we assign a mentor like that. So that is something that's very important. I agree with that. The accountability that a human brings, it's very hard for an AI to bring. So maybe one nice way to put these things together is the AI teaches, but for accountability and for this kind of social commitment, you still bring a human in the loop. And that's a very efficient system, because all you have to do is check-ins and pushing just like a coach would, right? So, that seemed to work for us for adults. Now, that brings me to the second point, right? Definitely, it's harder with children, because 5 to 10% of our customers are children. So I would see some peculiar behavior. So we'll be running lots of evals, one for just very peculiar behavior. And we started finding that a bunch of our users would make the AI end the session by saying things like, I'm very sick today, I need to go to the hospital. And when we started digging deeper, most of the time it turned out to be kids that's very peculiar because, and then we started realizing that when an adult doesn't like your class for whatever reason, they just drop off. But that's not the case with kids. They have this need to show up, because if you push them to show up, they would show up, but not all the time they're motivated still. So sometimes it's very hard to align their motivation because they're just not. So it's got to be very engaging, or you lose them. That's not the case with an adult. They are much more tolerant. They can get dopamine hits from just the actual process of learning and knowing that I did something worthwhile. So I think that's a little more easier with adults for sure. Kids, it's a lot more harder, is what I feel.
Great. I got a question coming from Argentina for Irina and James. Given the unique challenges of implementation, how do you actually judge efficacy when you're sitting at one of the large language model companies?
I'll jump in first. I think the implementation question is really important. And to James's point, we, of course, Google has country level engagements as well, and we're also working with Estonia and other countries. But the reason why we also do these RCTs ourselves is because we believe that there is a lot to kind of uncover. There's a lot of scientific research to do here. I think it's basically AI in education is a socio-technical problem. So it's not just about the technology, it's about how the society integrates this technology and works with the technology to really create something good. And so we did a randomized controlled trial in India and Sierra Leone and other countries. And what we see is that in every country, there will be different cultural context, different educational system, different levels of AI literacy in teachers and students, and attitude towards AI. So we really work closely with teachers to understand, okay, this is the tool. We give you basic AI literacy skills and explain how it works. But now, how do you see this tool integrated in your classroom? Why do you think your students will really engage with it, and why would they not engage with it? And we find very interesting patterns emerging where in India, for example, the teachers found that they prefer to do direct instruction, introducing the topic. Then the AI would take over and help the students go on these personalized exploratory journeys and practice sessions where the teacher knew that the students were engaged and working with AI, and they could walk around and find the students who actually needed their help the most and spend the time one-on-one having this kind of human interaction. And then they would go back and take over again from the AI to do exam prep. So like in exam conditions, when you're working on paper, how do you draw a number line? How do you kind of write down your equations in the way that is expected? So it felt like AI for them was this like nice multiplier and addition that worked in combination with what they already did really great.
I'm sorry, I'm getting we're like at the Oscars where they're starting to play the music here. I love your point that it's socio-technical, and gosh, I wish we had the nuance in our cultural dialogue to understand that deeply. James, do you want to take us out on a final word?
Sure, and I know people will run out of time, so I'll keep it very concise. Firstly, totally agreed that implementation is really about holistically bringing everyone along. It's the technology is in some ways secondary to upskilling teachers, upskilling students, making sure the context of use is right. That, to Andrea's point, the context also includes, curriculum alignment, language alignment, cultural alignment, all questions like that. How do we know at scale? How do we try and make sense of it? Probably in three ways. There are evaluations that we've developed that are consistent, that are pedagogically aligned, that give you kind of a snapshot view. Is it teaching in the right way to the right quality? Then there is building the infrastructure to run massive randomized controlled trials, which is what we do at the country level. And then three, it's making that infrastructure available to teachers and researchers all over the world, independent of OpenAI, and funding the WAC. And that's why we put together a $50 million fund for running effectively learning science research across the world, using our tools and technology to try and get statistically significant evidence wherever we can. We want those to happen in context for sort of a theoretical, abstract piece of research. So ideally, that happens in as many diverse places as we can possibly make happen. But I won't say any more, Ben, because I can see that you're going to get pulled off the Oscars stage.
Well, I would love to give an award to all of you for all of the insights that you dropped with us today. You heard it from James. It's called Edtech for a reason. The education comes first, the tech comes second. And for those of you who joined us, we will provide a recording. We don't have all the chat notes, so please make sure that you click on whatever links you want. Esteemed guests, Kristen, Irina, James, Andrea, Maharishi, thank you so much for joining our discussion today and wishing you tons of luck in the future. Keep us in the loop. Thank you.